Hey folks, George here. Today we're going to talk about the Japanese comic entitled My Brother's Husband by Tagame Gengoroh. It was written as installments between the years 2014 and 2017. That's going to be a very interesting time for these kinds of comics and this kind of discourse in Japan, right? This 2014-2017 era really. Some might even call it, some have labeled it, this post-2015 era for gay comics or LGBT issues in Japan. As always, I'll talk about the four story elements: plot, setting, characters, and themes. I'll also talk about other kinds of connections that we can make, including the actual text, the formal elements of the text itself, intertextual connections, that is with other works, history, connections with history, or insights that we can glean from historical information, and then also my own personal connection with the work. So with that in mind, I will start with the easiest way to discuss this work, and that is the plot. The plot is fairly easy to describe. We start, in the first few pages, all of this is described. We've got a Japanese man named Ryoji who is homosexual, and he marries a man named Mike Flanagan in Canada. He's moved to Canada and married Mike. Like I said, as the story starts, Ryoji dies and leaves Mike as a widower. As a result, Mike goes to Japan in search of Ryoji's family. Whose family? His brother, mainly, named Yaichi. And so that's where we get most of the engagement, most of the story, really all of the story, is this character Mike, a homosexual from Canada, who's in Japan and engaging with my brother's husband, Yaichi, the my brother's husband of the title, of course. We've also got a character named Kana, who is Yaichi's daughter. And so we see this interesting family dynamic. Yaichi caring for his daughter and also visited by this man that they've never met, Mike. And the story develops as really Yaichi engages with his own understanding and his own clarity and his own, really, memories of his gay brother. Really, here's what's interesting about this work. The protagonist of this work really is Yaichi, a straight Japanese male, right? We don't really see gay Japan in this comic at all, which is kind of surprising. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Why is that surprising? Now, this is a comic about gay issues, without question. But the protagonist, we visit and we engage with gay issues in this work. The reader engages with gay issues in this work through the lens, really, of Yaichi, a man who's trying to come to terms with his own experience of having a homosexual brother, his own experience in Japan, and the biases that come along with being a Japanese man. And we could say preconceived notions, right? Preconceived notions of gayness or homosexuality, especially in homosexual men in Japan in this, post-311 era. Now, I talk about the setting being Japan and this post-311 era. Now, I've talked quite a bit, I've made another video about this post-311 era in Japanese history, that is post-March 11th, 2011, when there was the triple disaster of the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown in Fukushima. I talk about that a lot more in my video about the film entitled Land of Hope by Sono-Sion. So if you want to see some of those details, you could go revisit that video of mine, yes? That said, however, the most important thing to really understand for now, I'm going to summarize some of that post-311 mood, you could say, in Japan, as merely suggesting that Japan feels like a land teetering on the brink, so to speak, teetering on the brink of collapse. Japan is not quite sure where it is, and Japanese people aren't quite sure who they are, what they are, in the face of this 311 disaster. So there's all sorts of interesting social attitudes There's all sorts of interesting social attitudes around this post-311 era, such that there is a lack of certainty, and people have this sense, perhaps, that society is falling apart. At least Japanese society is falling apart. So let's talk a little bit about the history around which Tagame creates this work, My Brother's Husband. To repeat, Japan feels like it's teetering on the brink of some sort of just collapse, ultimately. Part of that, which is interesting, part of the interpretation, social interpretation around that teeteringness, so to speak, is that Japan seems to have this crisis of masculinity. Who would describe it as a crisis of masculinity? Certainly the more traditionally minded conservative folks, such that, what might you say? There's not enough men being men anymore, and that's why society is feeling like it's teetering on the brink of the edge, on the brink of the precipice, so to speak, right? Another thing that's interesting about this era is what some scholars have called this post-2015 sort of era in LGBT issues, and this is certainly felt in Japan. What happens in 2015 to really make this watershed sort of year for LGBT issues, not just in Japan but around the world? Certainly, the United States Supreme Court case, Obergefell versus Hodges, where gay marriage in the United States was protected across the land. Now, of course, in the United States, there were many places that allowed for gay marriage, but this Supreme Court case decided and stipulated that, indeed, gay marriage across the United States is protected, and there shall legally be gay marriage in the United States. So that sense of success for LGBT issues is felt around the world. Certainly it is felt in Japan as well. What else happens in 2015? Well, in Japan, Tokyo Prefecture allows for not quite gay marriage certificates, right? But some sort of gay cohabitation certificates. This isn't the law of the land across Japan, but Tokyo implements such a policy, allowing gay, what in America we called civil unions before the legalization of gay marriage, before the Obergefell case, right? So there are certain certificates that are issued in Japan that feel like marriage, if not de jure marriage, right? To wrap up this discussion of history of gay issues in Japan, homosexuality in Japan, it is interesting to suggest and to realize and to do the research and see that same-sex relationships have a long history in Japan. There is interesting history of same-sex relationships in Japan. Going way back to the pre-modern era, we see samurai doing same-sex issues. You could see it in literature. Another place where we see it is in the Buddhist monasteries. Here's what's interesting, though, and this is going to be an interesting discussion to be had as we go into the next topic. The same-sex relationships that I've just described, the samurais, the Buddhist monks, let's say, they're not the same or similar same-sex relationships as we might understand them in 2023. In 2023 New York City, where I am, right? Why do I say that? Because there is always this hierarchical relationship, right? So in samurai same-sex marriages, there's a senior samurai who is having sexual relations with a younger samurai, right? As an apprentice sort of thing. Same exact relationship happens in Buddhist homosexual relationships, where there is a senior figure and a younger, more apprentice type of figure in this relationship. These are not the same-sex relationships that I'm thinking of as I live in the 21st century in New York City, right? They're not equal relationships, these historically same-sex relationships that I just described with the samurai and with these Buddhist monks. One last thing I want to talk about the history around gay experience in Japan, or homosexual activities, homosexual behavior in Japan, is that so much of this changed in the Meiji era. Why does this change happen as the Meiji era comes? Well, because of so much Western influence, right? So much Western Christian influence, which looks at certain behaviors and says, this is wrong behavior, this is better behavior. We don't allow this in our society. You shouldn't allow this in your society, right? And that influence does really take charge in the Meiji era, such that so many homosexual attitudes, so many homosexual behaviors are verboten. Why is this interesting? Let me talk for a moment about the textual formalism here. Chapter 1 is entitled, "The Black Ships Arrive." What does that bring to mind to anybody who knows a little bit of modern Japanese history? I talk about this a little bit in my Meiji era videos, one about the feminist writer Kishida Toshiko, and in another one about the Japanese writer Soseki Natsume. Anybody who knows a little bit about Japanese history knows that the black ships are a reference to Admiral Perry in 1852 coming to Japan, an American coming to Japan with black ships to open up Japan, and thus spurring the modernization of Japan from the pre-modern to the modern. Why is that interesting to me? It seems like Tagame is suggesting that Mike Flanagan is a figure coming from overseas, Canada, to open up Japan in the same way, to modernize Japan, to bring Japan some sort of wisdom to march forward in time, in the same way that Admiral Perry spurned modernization in Japan in 1852. Tagame is writing this work in 2014, suggesting, wait a second, let's spur some more revolution. Let's spur a revolution in the way that Japanese people think about homosexuality. Let's spur a revolution about Japanese attitudes towards homosexuality. Let's spur a revolution about Japanese biases around homosexuality. And there, Tagame puts it right there for us on the first page of the text. That is interesting because now I want to start talking about intertextual connections with this text, My Brother's Husband. What intertextual connections am I making? Well, the most obvious intertextual connections to make are with other works by Tagame, right? Now, Tagame is famous in the gay comics community in Japan for being a comics creator who is very prolific since the 80s, really, in making gay comics. What are some of the interesting features of Tagame's gay comics and other gay media across Japan in the late 20th century and early 21st century? One thing that is curious and has seen a bit of scholarly critique aimed towards artists like Tagame, but not just artists, all sorts of other media creators in Japan, including creators of magazines, ads, videos, porno videos, things like this, is that they are very, very masculine. Very, very masculine. Some might call it hyper-masculine. What do I mean by that? Well, what some scholars suggest is that a lot of Tagame's style of gay manga perpetuate this patriarchal society that is so prevalent in Japan. How would it do that? Well, in the same manner in which I described the homosexual relationships amongst samurai and Buddhist monks, there's clearly a hierarchical relationship here. Somebody who's above and somebody below. And you see that across a lot of Tagame's works. There is one very dominant figure and one very submissive figure. To repeat then, some scholars have critiqued his work, Tagame's work, and other gay artists in Japan, as perpetuating the masculine patriarchy that was so prevalent, that is still so prevalent in Japan. To be sure, this is contrasted with what are popularly called boys' love or beautiful youth comics in Japan that are mainly created by females, right? Why is that interesting? Because in so much of popular media, not gay media, but more widespread mainstream media, homosexual males are very frequently portrayed in a very feminine light, in a very feminine manner, exemplified in boys' love comics. Now, that's not to criticize boys' love comics or other sorts of portrayals. However, what it is to say is that artists like Tagame are trying to put forward a different, more masculine homosexual portrayal than is popular in more mainstream media, where, again, homosexual men are portrayed in a very effeminate manner and ridiculed as such. They're comic relief, so to speak. They're to be laughed at. They're humorous figures. Well, Tagame is making very hyper masculine figures in his gay comics, in his very sexually explicit gay comics. Another critique that might be suggested about Tagame's earlier homosexual comics is, in addition to being hyper-masculine, they really are merely consumerist masturbation aids, right? They are very pornographic, and in addition to maintaining this patriarchal hierarchy, they're really just there to sell masturbation aids to other young homosexual men. Let's talk about that for a second. What I find interesting about My Brother's Husband might be that Tagame is listening to certain critiques, or at least responding to certain critiques, or might not even heard or paid attention to such critiques, but wants to take his own gay storytelling into a different avenue. Whereas prior, he was making pornographic works, what I would call pornographic works. Here, he's giving a more mainstream story to really address homosexual issues in Japan. Why is that interesting to me? Well, in another video, prior video that I made about In the Realm of the Senses, the movie In the Realm of the Senses by Oshima, I suggest there that pornography isn't merely a masturbation tool, but it is in and of itself a political tool and a political expression also. Oshima in the Realm of the Senses does this sort of thing. So what I'm wondering is if Tagame's earlier extreme pornographic works are actually, in addition to being masturbation aids, nobody's going to deny that, right? Are they also political expressions? Keep that question in the back of our minds here, yeah? As you engage with, let's say, pornographic works, but also My Brother's Husband, where he is trying to say something a little bit more, forward-seeking. Now I'll start talking about the characters in a little bit more detail. I've described the plot, but let's get into the characters in a bit more detail here. The first character, the character whom I call the protagonist, is Yaichi. Who is Yaichi here? Yaichi is a single father raising his daughter, Kana. We'll talk about Kana in a second. But he is a straight man. He is a Japanese man. Now, through this work, perhaps we should read Yaichi as a synecdoche of Japan in general, of Japanese males in general. Why? Because throughout the text, Yaichi is exercising self-reflection. He's really the only character that goes through some real change from the beginning to the end of this first volume. How does he go through this change? He goes through this change through self-reflection and considering his own biases, his own worldviews that are, let's say, taught to him by society. Yes? Now, you hear me using the word bias. I certainly do not mean the word bias in any negative sense. Right? We've all got biases. In my other philosophy discussions, I might talk about bias. Bias is in all of us. We all see the world in a very interesting way. I happen to be a male. I see the world in this way. Right? I can't see the world as a female. That is my bias. Right? I don't know what it feels like to go through menstrual cramps. I can't perceive that. My biases are such that I am limited in how I see the world. Now, here's what's interesting. While I am going to suggest that biases are not in and of themselves moral, some biases we might want to make moral evaluations about. And that is what Yaichi is doing in this text. He is evaluating his biases, considering his biases, reflecting upon his biases and saying, wait, this might be a nice bias to maintain. For example, being a good parent. I am biased in favor of being a good parent, right? I hope you are too. But some other bias, such that homosexual activities, homosexual behavior is unnatural, that is a bias too. And Yaichi, through this text, is going to reconsider his attitudes and his approach and his perspective and his perceptions of homosexual behavior and homosexual people through the next character that I want to discuss, Mike Flanagan. Mike Flanagan is the my brother's husband of the title. Yaichi's brother, Ryoji, married Mike Flanagan. And Mike Flanagan comes from Canada to search and see. He speaks of making a promise to understand Japan. That said, what's interesting about Mike Flanagan? Mike Flanagan is a Canadian. Whereas Yaichi is Japanese, Mike Flanagan is Canadian. Now, if I'm suggesting that Yaichi is a synecdoche for Japanese men, for Japanese society, I might suggest that also Mike Flanagan is going to be some sort of stand-in for Western society. Here's a question to keep in mind, however, as we read this text and learn about Mike Flanagan. Has Tagame written a character that is an idealized Westerner? What do I mean by this idealization? Well, in gay Japan, many researchers have remarked about some idealized version of homosexuality in the West, in places like America, in places like Canada, in places like Europe, where homosexuality is a little bit more free to be expressed and open, right? Is Mike Flanagan an embodiment in this text of such attitudes? Perhaps. What might illustrate this? Well, we see Kana, the little girl in the text. She's asked, why do you like him so much? And she says, because he's a gaijin. I mean a Canadian, right? Because he's a foreigner. So there is this exotic notion of this foreigner coming, right? And saying, wow, look at that. Look at this foreigner. How neat. How wonderful. My question is, however, is Tagame and so much of other gay Japanese media trying to have this idealized version? Oh, the West is so much better in dealing with gay issues, in dealing with LGBT issues. Maybe, right? There is that overgeneralization that has been reported by many scholars, many anthropologists. However, I think Tagame is hip to that question. What do I mean? Because there is this part where, after this coming out episode that we'll discuss in a bit, Mike acknowledges. He says, yes, my parents, when I came out, my parents were liberal too. But coming out still requires courage. And a little bit later, he says, actually, many people don't accept it. Why does he have to say that? Well, because I think Tagame is hip to this idealization of the West. So in such places, I'm in New York, in places like New York City, where homosexual lifestyles are widely accepted. In places like San Francisco, in places like Los Angeles, in places like Vancouver, where Mike is from. In the big cities, of course, there's a lot more homosexual acceptance. However, America's a big country, and there's a lot more to America than merely the big cities. And so I think it's brilliant that Tagame includes this line in the text when he says, actually, even in Canada, many people don't accept it, right? Because Canada is more, America is more than merely the big cities. There are still strides to be made regarding LGBT issues. So if America has more gay rights, gay acceptance, or Canada has more gay acceptance than Japan, perhaps, but it's still, many people don't accept it, right? And I think, like I said, Tagame is brilliant for pointing this out to the Japanese reader, the Japanese gay reader. The third character who's quite significant in this text is Kana, the little girl. Why does Tagame create a young female character? Well, I talk about young female characters when I did my analysis on Spirited Away. You can watch that video that I previously made. What do I say there? There is some sort of innocence in Kana, right? As a young female character, as a child, right? As a matter of fact, she says in many places, oh yes, I understand. She understands perfectly, but Yaichi, he's speechless. Why? Because, as I mentioned earlier, as Yaichi, being a Japanese man, and being a stand-in for Japanese adults, the adults are already indoctrinated. But the children have open minds. They're not indoctrinated by all kinds of social mores and social values yet. And so it's easy for her to say, oh yes, I understand, I get it. The child is not yet indoctrinated, right? Furthermore, Yaichi later on says, yeah, kids are lucky. They don't have to worry about that stuff. Of course, that comment is betrayed later in the text when we see a child who's really wrestling with serious problems here. So, my interpretation of the text is that the character of Kana is there to show the reader, to reveal to the reader that there can be a more open-minded attitude towards something that my biases tell is different. My biases tell me this is a different lifestyle. Well, we don't need to have those biases. And that is embodied with this child character of Kana. Now let's talk about the themes that this work explores. There are many themes, many complicated themes, that Tagame engages with in My Brother's Husband. Obviously, we've talked a lot about social values. And what are the social values that are being exemplified, the attitudes that are taken towards homosexuals in Japan, embodied through the character of Yaichi, right? Well, one thing is, of course, the very first rabbit that comes out of the hat is the fact that in Canada, gay men and gay women are allowed to get married legally. And they ask right at the beginning, it's weird, Kana asks, because, again, from the mouths of babes, right? It's weird that it's okay there in Canada, but it's not here okay. And how does Yaichi respond? Yeah, you're right. However, what I love is the brilliance of that panel that Tagame illustrates. Why? Because we see the double meaning there. What's weird? What's the weirdness? Right? Is the weirdness Canada, where Yaichi might be thinking, or the typical Japanese adult might be thinking, yeah, Canada's the weird place? Or is it Japan that's the weird place for not allowing such marriages? Right? And Kana's asking this question. Now, in this frame, it's not clear, right? You can read it any way, and I'm reading this frame, and I'm not sure how Yaichi internalizes that question. And he says, yeah, you're right, it is weird. It is weird. My hunch is that Kana is saying it's weird. Well, which one is weird? Canada or Japan? Right? Well, you ask some people might say that both are weird for legalizing marriage at all. Why should the government be involved with marriage in any case? Well, that's a different discussion for another time. But here, it seems clear that Tagame is trying to ask that question. Why is it that other places can allow for gay marriage, but not Japan? And Yaichi doesn't even realize the weirdness of such a question, right? Another great symbolic element to this text that really illustrates this social values and the biases and the reflections upon our own biases is when they talk about tempura sushi. And, later on in the text, Mike says, yeah, in Canada we've got all kinds of sushi that you don't have here in Japan. Yaichi says, tempura sushi? Actually, that sounds disgusting. Tempura sushi sounds disgusting. How disgusting is tempura sushi? I think that's a great example of when I suggest that bias, in and of itself, is not moral or immoral. We all have a way of seeing the world, right? There might be immoral biases and more moral biases. For example, I am biased against serial killers. Call me crazy. I'm biased against serial killers. But that is a bias. I like that bias. I think it's a moral bias to have. But not all biases must be moral judgments. Like, for example, the taste of tempura sushi. Yeah, I'm trying to picture tempura sushi right now. I like tempura. How would it be different if it was tempura sushi? I'm not sure. But Yaichi is biased against it. He's got, God, this sounds disgusting. Well, must it be disgusting? Right? Or is this something that's taught to us? Is this something that's indoctrinated upon us? Tempura sushi, for example. The taste that tempura sushi is disgusting. Or the fact that something like gay marriage is outlawed. Is that a bias that's merely been thrust upon us by social forces? Along with this discussion of social values and reflection upon biases might be this discussion that we see in My Brother's Husband, this Western values in Japan. Western values in Japan. Why do I bring that up? Right? Well, first of all, Mike is the embodiment of a Westerner coming to Japan and teaching the young girl, and teaching Yaichi too, about different values, about a different way of looking at the world. Right? And how does this really manifest in the text? I love this line. When Kana asks, what's jet lag? What's jet lag mean? Why is that so fascinating to me? Because in that short frame, in that brief frame, we see everything about the frame by which everybody is looking at the world. And we see the frame by which Kana sees the world. Her frame is uniquely Japanese. Yaichi's too, in a certain way. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by that? They've never traveled outside of Japan. Kana doesn't even know that there is a world outside of Japan. Barely. Well, Kana's never been outside of Japan. Otherwise, she would have known what jet lag is, right? If she would have been to Canada with her uncle, Ryoji, before he died, she would have experienced jet lag. I know whenever I go to Japan, I experience jet lag terribly. So much so that, because of the severe time change, about 12 hours, I literally lose a day sleeping whenever I go to Japan and then come back. You'll know jet lag if you travel. If you have experiences outside of your usual frame of reference. That notion, that question, what's jet lag mean? Just brings home the whole idea that, hey, wait a second, here in Japan, we might want to travel. We might want to get out of Japan to see the way other people around the world view different things, like homosexuality, right? We've also got this idea, and I did mention it earlier, is there this Western idealization amongst gay people in Japan? Maybe, right? Where there is this, oh wow, if only I was in New York where I could be more free. But like I said earlier, I love that passage where Mike says, it's not perfect where I'm from either, right? There's still a lot of people who don't accept it. However, what did Ryoji do? Ryoji moved abroad. Ryoji moved abroad. And what does Yaichi, their surviving brother, say? As a result of Ryoji moving abroad, he says, maybe Mike knew Ryoji better than I did in the end. What does that imply? That in Japan, Yaichi didn't even know his brother that well. That he moved away into a foreign land, Canada, to see himself, find himself, really know who he himself was. I'm going to back up a little bit here, because this is a danger, isn't it? When we read this work, and we're bringing in, I'm George, and bringing in my own biases. Now, you'll forgive me, but when I talk about homosexual issues, when I talk about LGBT issues in New York City in the 21st century, I talk a lot about things like gay identity. I talk a lot about things like, people finding their true selves. Is such discussion legitimate in the Japanese psyche? Right? Now, there are some Japanese scholars who have talked since modernity, since this transition to modernity. There are some Japanese scholars who do talk about these things and say, all this talk about individualism, all this talk about identity, individual identity, true self, it's a completely foreign concept in Japan. Right? Now, that is, by the way, a controversial take. Now, I do take sides in this debate. I don't agree with people like Karatani Kojin, who suggests that there is no such thing as a true identity in the Japanese psyche because it's such a foreign concept. Now, I don't want to get into that debate right now, but only to say that this is a controversial idea. And are so many of these issues of gay rights, right? Gay concerns, gay issues, are they Western ideas? And that's what I asked when I said, what is the place of Western values in Japan? And I do think that this work is engaging with that complicated question. You'll notice in Volume 1, there's never any talk, even in the coming out episode that we will discuss in a bit. There's never any talk in this whole text of true self or true identity or things like that. I find that quite interesting, actually, because might it be a different way of talking about this thing, right? Gay or otherwise, gay, straight, otherwise, white, black, brown, otherwise, female, male, otherwise, or otherwise. It might be a different way of thinking about these things when you don't include words like identity, true identity, things like that. And there is a lot of debate, even in Japan today, around those sorts of questions. I think the other thing that we have to discuss, that's right on the surface, it's right in the title, My Brother's Husband, is the nature of family and family structure in Japan and around the world, right? What do I mean by this? Oh, the very interesting feature about this is that we've got Yaichi, who is questioning and trying to wrap his head around homosexual marriage, a different kind of family structure than he's accustomed to. Yet he himself is a single father. He himself is a single father, a rather untraditional family structure in Japan. And by the way, in America as well, and Canada, right? The single father. Yet he's moving on with it. As a matter of fact, it's quite interesting that later on in the text, we meet his ex-wife, Yaichi's ex-wife. Mike is blown away. He says something like, oh, I didn't know you had an ex-wife. I just assumed that she died. And that's what I kind of like about Tagame's brilliance here, is that he's not merely making Mike this perfect figure, right? But Mike is coming in with his own assumptions as well. Mike says, I'm a Japanophile. I'm an otaku. I love Japan, right? He's got all of his assumptions about Japan as well. Yeah? So Mike isn't perfect or bias-free either when we see his awareness of this interesting family structure such that Yaichi is a single father, a divorced single father, right? This is what's really interesting to me, is when Yaichi says, oh, I don't do much as a single father. I'm just a single father. What's Mike's response to that? Mike says, but you're Kana's dad. That is very nice work, if you ask me. That is going back to that discussion of masculinity, right? And where I suggested that Tagame's earlier works perpetuate traditional, despite the fact that they are homosexual, they still seem to perpetuate certain elements of masculinity in Japan. Here he brings in a different notion of masculinity. Wait a second. Being a father is very nice work, if you ask me. Being a father is very nice work, if you ask me. Doesn't that challenge the traditional notion of family structure in Japan? Well, Tagame puts it forward as such. The other question in this interesting family structure, which is, at least to me, a very important question, is, as a family, how do you raise children? And that question comes up more than a couple times in this text. More than a couple times in this text, where Yaichi asks, is this the correct way to raise children? Or, this is the correct way to raise children. Or, it's my duty as her father. Right? And the volume 1 of this text, volume 1, closes with Yaichi as a father questioning, well, how do I want to raise my daughter? What if Kana grows up to be gay and to be in love with a woman? As a father, he wrestles with this, even as he's reflecting upon his own biases and trying to be the best father he can be. Of course he loves his daughter, but he's wondering, my goodness, what if? Because he is concerned to be the best father he can be. How do you do that? That is a complicated question that I think Tagame is asking in this text. Tagame is saying, let's talk about that. Let's talk about being a parent. And we see many different parents trying to raise their children in different ways. Ways that lead into the next theme that I want to talk about, gay discrimination. Discrimination in Japan against gay lifestyles. And we see some parents saying, oh, this is a bad influence, they say. This is a bad influence. I don't want my child to hang out with Kana anymore because it's a bad influence. Kana, being the youthful, innocent girl that she is, she asks, what does the word negative influence mean? What does negative influence mean? Some parents are going to say, Mike is a negative influence, right? What's negative about Mike? Presumably, their attitude is that his homosexuality is negative. And of course, in engaging with somebody calling you or calling your uncle, your beloved uncle, a negative influence, right? Or your brother-in-law, calling your brother-in-law a negative influence. Emotion comes out, and I think that's an important theme in this work too, which might actually be seen as controversial in a certain way, or at least the way I'm questioning this theme is controversial, and that is the theme of real emotions. Now, what do I even mean by this notion of real emotions? I don't know. It seems weird to me, but that's just the first term that came to my mind when I'm thinking this. Let's give some examples first to see what I'm wrestling with in my own thinking, within my own biased perspective here when I use this term real emotions. Well, what do we see? We see that Mike comes home drunk and is in love and approaches Yaichi and says, "Oh my goodness, Ryoji." He thinks Yaichi is Ryoji. After all, they are described as twin brothers earlier in the text, right? And Ryoji's scared. But how does Mike respond to this? He cries. He says, "I missed you." Right? He tears up. Crying seems to be the release, at least in this text, a symbolic release of real, what I'm calling real emotions, right? And Ryoji even reflects and recalls his own parents' funeral. And he says, "Ryoji cried at our parents' funeral. I was jealous," he says, "because until tonight, I hadn't shed a tear. I had never cried." Now again, this is this question that I raised earlier in this discussion. Might this text be examining and asking, what does it mean to be masculine in Japan? And Yaichi is acknowledging, until tonight, I hadn't shed a tear. Why not? We've also got crying happening during this coming out episode that I'll describe in a moment. Where's another example of this crying? Mike asks Kana. He asks, "Are you sad without a mom?" How does Kana respond? "No way!" She needs to be strong, right? But then she says, "Sometimes." Right? And here's the part that punches me in the face. When Mike hugs her and she says, "What's this?" What's this? It's a hug. It's a hug. And later on in the text, Kana asks her dad, "Daddy, why don't you hug me? Don't you love me?" Because, of course, from the mouths of babes, of course, the innocent mouth of babes. Kana has not yet been indoctrinated into this Japanese society as a child. She hasn't been indoctrinated yet, such that hugs are inappropriate. And what does Yaichi say? "Oh, Japanese people don't hug. It's not customary." Okay, fair enough. I understand that certain behaviors are customary or not, but I'm wondering if Tagame is challenging that customary behavior and saying, why don't Japanese people hug? Right? Why don't Japanese people hug? And Yaichi even mentions about his daughter. Even at this age, her young age, she's careful not to be seen sulking. I'm twisting that a little bit in my own mind, in my own interpretation. I'm twisting that to ask, wait, it seems like even at this age, she's learning not to express her emotions. Why do I feel like this is weird? Well, I feel like this is weird because it seems to me that I'm talking about something called real emotions. That's how I labeled it, right? I don't even know what that means. And hold on a second, because I might contrast that with Tagame's earlier pornographic work, right? Where it's just hardcore sex and masturbation aids. Wait a second. isn't that sort of pleasure, that sort of hedonistic pleasure, aren't those real emotions too? By the way, isn't controlling and holding back your emotions, isn't that a real emotion too? So I'm not quite sure how to best express the point I'm trying to make. I don't like calling it real emotions versus something else. But there is a certain emotional aspect to this text that Tagame is writing about. So I'm wondering if Tagame is writing this text and challenging or asking us to question the more conventional way that Japanese people express emotions, right? Such that they don't cry, such that they don't hug. And I'll bring this point home with the episode, the coming out episode, at the end of Volume 1 of My Brother's Husband. A young boy, a neighborhood boy, has heard that a gay man, Mike, is visiting the neighborhood and is, somehow related to Kana. So he's kind of spying around, waiting to talk to Mike. And he asks, "Can I talk to Mike?" And Mike has this conversation away from us, away from the reader. We don't know how that conversation goes. It remains a secret. It's an intimate exchange between Mike and this young boy. And the boy is coming out and saying, "I'm gay. I just needed to talk to somebody." And I think that's why the emotional aspect is so important. So we see these emotions being expressed by the only homosexual Japanese character in this text. This young boy. We don't see any other Japanese homosexuals in the whole text. It might remind me that this text isn't about Japanese homosexual experience at all. Rather, it's about the straight experience and how the straight experience and attitude and biases towards homosexual individuals in Japan. And so what's so touching about this coming out episode is that the boy cries because he's revealed something. He's told something that he's never told anybody else. Again, the language of true identity is never used in this text. My true self. They don't say that. But he does say, "I needed to talk to somebody." And that's what I love about the text here. We see this isolation in the boy. And throughout these pages, we see so many different emotions around being gay. We see the anxiety. They talk about the boy. He has so much stress around him. Mike even says, I needed so much courage to come out myself. And so we see all of these complicated emotions that are coming out, along with this revealing coming out that I, this character, am gay. And that's why I think emotions are so important here. Whether they're true emotions or real emotions or deep emotions, I don't know what any of that means. What I do think it means, though, what I do see in this text is something like this bottled up stress, anxiety that needs to come out, that needs to be dealt with. And Tagame is brilliant for bringing this comic forward. And now let's talk about the formal text as a comic. There are so many interesting things that we see in the visual nature that you wouldn't get out of a prose work. And so we get this comic. We get this visual representation of isolation, of the emotions that this boy is feeling. It's this boy standing all alone in a black void. How do you express this with linguistic communication? It's hard, but in an instant, I see it and I feel the isolation. I feel the complex emotions that this boy who has never come out before feels with this one image. And there is something interesting about the comic medium. This is something that the comic medium can do that prose cannot do in virtue of its visual nature. The embodiment, the visual expression, the visual illustration of isolation and emotion, I think is so beautiful in this work. Let me talk about my own personal connection with this work. Well, I love all artists who transgress boundaries. And Tagame is transgressing all sorts of boundaries with this work. What boundaries is he transgressing? Well, number one, he's discussing these interesting gay issues and asking Japan, asking Yaichi, asking Japanese men to question their own biases and their own attitudes and to self-reflect upon these issues. Right? Just asking these questions is transgressing a boundary in Japan. That's one way he's doing it. The other way that he's doing it, though, is that he's coming from a pornographic background. I love people who skip around genres, the boundaries of genres. Right? So many times I hear people say, oh, he's a pornographic comic artist. Stay in pornography. That's where the money is, after all. He made lots of money. He is a successful gay comics, pornographic comics artist. He transgresses the boundary to say, wait, I'm going to make a non-pornographic work. I'm going to make a serious work for mainstream audiences. I could do that too. And still make pornographic works too, by the way. I love that transgression of boundaries that Tagame's engaging with here. It makes me think that if all along those hardcore sexual images were actually expressing some sort of political goal, some sort of political ideal, might we even go a step further, right? Even as a masturbation aid. Is masturbation, after all, a political expression? Might it be? And that's why I love this work, because it asks so many complicated questions. And has the courage to ask these questions, especially given Tagame's background. Yeah. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.